The classroom erupted in stunned silence after the words left the teacher's mouth. Maybe if you spent less time acting like a thug and more time paying attention, you'd actually learn something. The insult sliced through the air, raw and sharp, and for a moment, every sound in the room vanished. The ticking clock, the scratching pencils, even the faint hum of the projector. All eyes turned toward Marcus, the 15-year-old boy seated near the back. His hand, still half raised from attempting to answer a question, trembled before he slowly lowered it. A faint laugh bubbled from one corner of the room, quickly stifled by the weight of the teacher's glare. Most of the students avoided looking at Marcus altogether, staring at their notebooks, the floor, anywhere but at him. Heat rose in Marcus's face, his skin burning under the unwanted spotlight. His throat tightened as though he'd swallowed a stone, yet he forced himself to stay upright in his seat. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but his words clung stubbornly to the back of his mouth. The teacher had not just corrected him, she had branded him. The classroom itself seemed to have shifted. The posters of famous scientists and authors lining the walls now looked like mocking spectators. The neat rows of desks felt like prison bars. Even the sunlight spilling across the floor through half-open blinds seemed harsher, unforgiving. Marcus heard whispers around him, the kind of whispers that sting more than shouts. Did she really say that? That's messed up. He looked so mad. A few students smirked, finding humor in his humiliation, while others kept their heads low, pretending not to notice. His teacher, Ms. Aldridge, adjusted her glasses and carried on as though nothing had happened. "Now, who else wants to try solving the equation?" she asked, her voice smooth, almost dismissive. She did not glance back at Marcus, as if erasing him from the room, but Marcus could still feel every gaze lingering on him, heavy and suffocating. His hands clenched into fists beneath the desk, nails biting into his palms. He told himself not to cry. Not here, not in front of them. His pride was all he had left to hold on to. For the rest of the class, he stared at the equations on the board, though the numbers blurred. Each tick of the clock carved itself into his memory, stretching the minutes into hours. When the bell finally rang, the classroom erupted in chatter once again, students spilling into the hallway. Yet the sting of those words clung to Marcus like a shadow that refused to lift. As he gathered his books, a voice behind him muttered just loud enough, "Guess she told you, huh?" Followed by a chuckle. Marcus turned, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. He walked out of the classroom with his head high, his silence hiding the storm building inside him. What Ms. Aldridge didn't know, what none of the students knew, was that her words had not ended the story. They had only begun it, like if you believe no student should be silenced by prejudice. The hallway after math class felt longer than usual, the linoleum floor stretching endlessly beneath Marcus's shoes. His books pressed tight against his chest, his eyes fixed on the ground. But the voices followed him, sliding like knives through the air. "Did you hear what Miss Aldridge said?" one student whispered. "Yeah, she was right, though. He's always acting tough," another replied. A third voice chimed in with a laugh. "Man, if a teacher calls you a thug, you gotta be doing something wrong." Marcus's chest tightened. He walked faster, his sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. He wanted to outrun the words, but they clung to him, clanging in his ears with every step. By the time he reached his locker, his hands were trembling. He fumbled with the combination, forcing the lock open with a sharp tug, pretending not to hear the low chuckles behind him. At lunch, he sat at the far end of a table. His usual friends were there, but their laughter felt distant, foreign. No one brought up the incident directly, but he caught them sneaking glances his way. When one of them finally spoke, it was worse than silence. "Yo, Marcus," a boy said lightly, trying to sound casual. "You really let her clown you like that?" The table erupted with laughter. It wasn't all of them, but it was enough. Marcus's stomach dropped, and the food on his tray turned to ash. He pushed it away and left the cafeteria without another word. That night, Marcus sat at his desk at home, staring at his math homework. The numbers blurred again, just as they had in class. His mother knocked softly before entering his room. "Marcus, you've barely touched your dinner. What's going on?" He hesitated, his pencil frozen in his hand. "Nothing. Just school. She sat on the edge of his bed, her eyes searching his face. Don't tell me nothing. I know when something's wrong. For a moment, he almost told her. The words were right there, the insult, the laughter, the weight pressing on him since that day. But instead he swallowed them, afraid of what might follow. Would she storm into school? Would things get worse? I'm fine, Mom, he said softly, forcing a smile. She didn't look convinced, but she kissed his forehead and left the room, leaving Marcus alone with his silence. The next morning, the weight hadn't lifted. When he walked into math class again, he felt the air shift. Ms. Aldridge stood at the board, writing equations in neat, perfect lines. She barely acknowledged him as he slipped into his seat. But when he raised his hand to answer a problem, she called on another student instead, not even glancing at him. Later, when she did address him, her tone carried that same sharp edge. Marcus, maybe if you actually tried to focus instead of staring off into space, you'd get the right answer for once. A ripple of laughter passed through the room. Marcus sank lower in his chair, fists tightening until his knuckles turned white. Every correction from her felt less like teaching and more like cutting, slicing away pieces of his confidence in front of an audience. Days passed, and each one felt heavier. Marcus found himself sitting alone more often, drifting through hallways like a ghost. His friends stopped waiting for him after class. In the cafeteria, empty seats seemed to stretch around him as though his shame was contagious. One afternoon, as he walked past the stairwell, he heard voices echoing. He paused, realizing it was some of his classmates. She's right. He thinks he's smart, but he's just another kid from the block. Did you see his face when she said it? Priceless. Laughter followed, bouncing off the walls. Marcus stood frozen, the words slamming into him like stones. His throat burned, his eyes stung, but he refused to let the tears fall. He clenched his fists and walked away, each step louder than the last. That night, lying in bed, the storm inside him refused to quiet. His heart pounded with rage, with humiliation, with the unbearable need for things to change. He could no longer pretend this would pass on its own. The insult had started it. The whispers had fed it. The isolation had cemented it. But Marcus knew one thing now. He could not remain silent any longer. Teacher insults, black student in class, but faces. A shocking lesson. Marcus sat at his desk on Thursday morning, his notebook open but blank. The numbers written on the board swam in his vision, as though they were resisting him, mocking him. Around him, the classroom hummed with low chatter, the scratching of pencils, the squeak of a chair leg against the tile. But Marcus felt detached, as if he were watching the scene through glass. He had carried the weight of Ms. Aldridge's words for days. Thug, she had called him. Distracted. Lazy. Words that had spread through the school like wildfire, setting fire to his friendships, searing his confidence. Every hallway laugh, every cafeteria whisper was a fresh burn. Today, though, something was different. His hands shook, yes, but not from fear alone. It was something sharper, heavier, resolve. He had replayed the insults enough times in his mind that they no longer crushed him. They had hardened him. Ms. Aldridge turned from the chalkboard, her eyes scanning the class before landing on Marcus. She lingered, as though waiting for him to slip, to confirm her narrative. Marcus, she said finally, her voice carrying across the room. Would you like to explain why you haven't solved a single problem yet? Or are you just here to warm the seat again? A ripple of laughter rolled through the room. Marcus felt the heat rise in his chest, the blood rushing to his ears. He glanced down at his paper, empty, accusing him. Then slowly, he lifted his eyes. I didn't solve it, he said, his voice low at first, because I couldn't see the board. The room stilled. Ms. Aldridge raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? I couldn't see the board, Marcus repeated, louder this time. His throat burned, but the words came steady. The glare from the window makes it hard. I've told you before. You didn't listen, a murmur ran through the students. Marcus rarely spoke up, and never against her. Ms. Aldridge crossed her arms. So now it's my fault you're failing? That's convenient. Marcus pushed back his chair, the screech of the metal legs cutting through the silence. He stood, his palms flat on the desk to steady himself. No, he said, meeting her gaze. "It's your fault for calling me names instead of teaching me. It's your fault for making me feel small in front of everyone." The air thickened. The students shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Marcus and their teacher. "You don't talk to me like that," Ms. Aldridge snapped, her voice sharp. "Why not?" Marcus's voice trembled, but he didn't back down. "You talked to me like I was less than human. You called me a thug in front of everyone." "You don't even know me." The silence that followed was crushing. A pencil dropped somewhere in the back row, the sound unnaturally loud. Ms. Aldridge opened her mouth, but no words came. For the first time, Marcus saw something flicker across her face. Not authority, not anger, but hesitation. From the doorway, another voice entered. "What was that, Ms. Aldridge?" The principal, Mr. Benson, stood in the threshold, having arrived unnoticed. His expression was stern, his arms folded. "Did I just hear a teacher accused of calling a student a thug?" Gasps filled the room. Marcus's heart pounded. He hadn't expected this, hadn't planned for witnesses. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to nod. "Yes, sir," she said it. Everyone heard. Dozens of heads turned toward Ms. Aldridge. Some students nodded reluctantly, others whispered to each other. Mr. Benson stepped fully into the room. "Marcus, would you step outside with me for a moment?" Marcus hesitated, then gathered his notebook and walked past Ms. Aldridge. He felt the heat of her glare, but also the weight of the students' eyes on his back. For once, they weren't laughing. In the hallway, Mr. Benson's voice was calm but firm. "Thank you for speaking up, Marcus." "That was brave. I'll need a full statement, and I'll need to talk to your parents." Marcus swallowed hard. "Am I in trouble?" "Not at all," Mr. Benson said. "But this kind of behavior from a teacher is serious. You shouldn't have to carry it alone." Something inside Marcus cracked, and relief rushed in where fear had lived. His shoulders sagged as though he had been carrying a weight for months and finally set it down. Back in the classroom, the silence lingered. Ms. Aldridge stood stiffly at the front, her authority fractured. The eyes of her students no longer obedient, but questioning. For Marcus, the turning point had arrived. The insult that once defined him was no longer his burden. It was hers. Teacher insults, black student in class, but faces a shocking lesson. The whispers in the hallway no longer carried Marcus's name. For days after the confrontation, the students spoke in hushed tones about Ms. Aldridge instead. Some were shocked, some delighted, others uneasy. But what was certain was this: the balance of power had shifted. Marcus noticed it the very next morning. When he walked into school, the usual stares and muffled laughter were gone. Heads turned still, but this time in recognition, not mockery. A boy who once laughed the loudest at Ms. Aldridge's jokes nudged his friend and muttered, "Yo, that's him." He stood up to her. In math class, the silence was different now. Ms. Aldridge sat stiff at her desk, her voice subdued, her authority dimmed. She avoided Marcus's eyes, avoided any remark that might cut too deep. The students sensed it, their usual snickers replaced by uneasy quiet. By afternoon, Marcus was called into the principal's office. His mother was already there, sitting across from Mr. Benson. Her expression was tight, protective, but her eyes softened when she saw her son. "Marcus," she said gently, reaching for his hand. "Mr. Benson told me what happened." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Marcus lowered his gaze. "I didn't want to make it worse." His mother squeezed his hand, her voice firm now. "Worse is letting people walk over you, baby. Speaking up was the right thing. I'm proud of you." Marcus's throat tightened, and for the first time in days, tears filled his eyes, not from shame, but from relief. Mr. Benson leaned forward, his voice steady. "Marcus, your courage has opened our eyes. What you endured should never have happened. We are addressing it. Ms. Aldridge will face disciplinary action, and she'll undergo mandatory training. But more importantly, you should know. You were heard." The words sank into Marcus slowly, like warmth spreading through cold hands. He had been heard. That evening, sitting at the dinner table, Marcus told his mother everything: the names, the laughter, the loneliness. She listened without interrupting, her face a mixture of sorrow and pride. When he finished, she said softly, "You turned your pain into power. That's something no one can take from you. The next week, the atmosphere in school shifted further. Classmates who once avoided him now greeted him with nods. A girl from science class whispered, "That was brave, what you did." Another boy muttered an awkward apology for laughing at him. Marcus didn't need their approval, but he felt the weight of isolation lifting, replaced by something new, respect. Even in math class, the dynamic was changed. Ms. Aldridge carried on with her lessons, but her words were careful, her tone less sharp. Her power no longer commanded the room. It was checked by the knowledge that she could be held accountable. One afternoon, Marcus stayed behind after the bell. Ms. Aldridge looked up, startled. "Marcus," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. I shouldn't have spoken to you the way I did." Marcus studied her, the woman who once made him feel so small. Her words weren't enough to erase the damage, but they marked something important: acknowledgement. He nodded once, not in forgiveness, but in recognition. "Just treat the next kid better," he said quietly, then walked out. That night, Marcus stood by his bedroom window, looking out at the darkening sky. For the first time, the weight in his chest was gone. He knew the fight wasn't just his, that many faced the same pain, the same prejudice. But he had found something in himself he didn't know was there, the strength to speak, even when his voice shook, and that strength had changed everything.